Hi, everybody, and welcome to Neuroscientists Talk Shop. Today is November 13th, 2025, and we're with Maria Diehl. Maria is Assistant Professor in Psychological Sciences at Kansas State University. And her laboratory studies fear and avoidance learning in animals and social learning, which includes things like learning by watching and animals communicating with each other during learning. Hi, Maria. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Also with us today is Tony Burgos-Robles,
Hi there.
podcast favorite.
How are you?
Podcaster. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you.
And Itamar Lerner,
Yes.
our psychological colleague from the psychology department, who's been on the podcast several times before. He works on cognitive psychology and sleep, emotion, and learning. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
And me, I'm your host, Charlie Wilson. So, Maria, I'm hoping, I know there's a lot, you guys have a lot you want to talk to each other about. I want to hear it all. But I'd like to start us by talking a little bit about learning by watching. So we know we do it. Like I was always taught, you watch it once, you try it once, you teach it once. That's how you get good at something. So, but when neuroscientists think about learning in the laboratory, we usually think about sensory input and neuronal pathways that carry some kind of representation of that, and then a motor output that has to somehow be appropriate and has to be generated as a representation, and then a representation of reinforcement or whatever it is that we're trying for. And then synaptic plasticity happens at some place where all those things meet, and that's learning. You know, I know that's probably not true, but that's what we all, whether we admit it or not, that's what we're all thinking. And so how can we reconcile that way of thinking about learning with learning by watching?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know, when I think about learning by watching or observational learning, you're able to take all the stuff in without having to directly experience it first off. So, you lots of visual information happening for humans. Watching what the person's doing, maybe the sequence of events that might be happening, and then using that as information that you store perhaps as a memory for later when you are put in that same situation. Okay, what did that person do? So you go back and recall that memory. Oh yeah, I think I saw them do this. This took some more time, or this in this situation, this other thing was happening, so you have to attend to that as well. And that kind of provides, an enhancement of learning for that first time in your own situation. Okay, well, they did it this way. I'm going to try it that way first. So having some of that prior information ready at hand before you're directly put in that situation. And thinking about danger, that can be very beneficial. Instead of directly learning it for the first time, you might be harmed. So if you see someone else going through that same experience, you get that information very quickly without putting yourself in harm's way. So in that regard, I think it's very optimal. If you're a social species, you can learn through observation, and you get it before you have to feel it.
So with us, like if I watch you in a avoidance task, and I understand the thing you're avoiding and the way you're doing it, I don't need any practice. I should be able to just do what you did. But at least our animal friends that are subjects in these experiments, they don't do that. I think maybe they would in the right circumstances, but in these experiments, the thing that's being avoided is usually a foot shock. It's completely unnatural, and they have no past experience with it. Sometimes you give them past experience with it, so they kind of know. And so, in that case, what are we expecting to happen with watching? It's just that, you don't expect that they're already going to know the task.
Mm-hmm.
You expect that they're going to learn it faster or learn some aspect of it differently? Or
yeah, I guess the prediction would be you'd hope they would learn it faster, but I think that also depends on the complexity of what it is you want them to learn, right? So a lot of the prior work looking at observational learning of something aversive has been done with things like fear conditioning, or where the animal's watching the other animal get shocked, right? And that's just a very salient event, and it's very simple, right? You see another animal, responding to something bad happening. And so that can be, encoded pretty easily. And then you can use that information later. But when it's something more complicated, like first learning something is associated with something bad and then making some other response to get away from that bad thing, there's lots of steps involved in that. So, it's going to require a lot more cognitive power and making sure the animal can see all those things happening and learning from them through observation before we test them. And hopefully they can get all that information.
I guess for our animal friends, it wasn't easy to figure it out, right? It was just a strategy that ended up working the best, right? Evolutionarily speaking, right? Not experiencing harm by themselves or, being exposed to a predator is a strategy that would work, right?
Oh, yeah.
But by observing others going through those experiences, like learning could happen really fast and also in the most optimal, perhaps, manner, but also the safest manner.
Yeah, and
possible.
we do that.
Exactly.
And actually, animals in the wild do that. An animal sees another animal go into a trap, and is not going to go into that same trap tomorrow. Exactly. In the laboratory, you worked with monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine monkeys are very quick at learning not to do what turned out badly for the other monkey.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of rat experiments, it seems like it's a lot harder. Is this just because they're just not wired to learn this stuff by watching, or is it something about our experiments?
Maybe a little bit of both. For one, we know that rodents are not visually dominant, right? They rely on other cues, auditory cues, olfactory cues. So there could be other things going on that they're not watching per se, but picking up on other cues that another animal would be emitting that they could use then to understand what might be happening.
I would guess ultrasonic vocalizations could be even a better use of information than visual, especially since a lot of rodents are nocturnal, right? Ultrasonic vocalizations, as you were mentioning earlier today, that which one is it, like on the lower end range of ultrasonic vocalizations that are more related to threat and danger?
And a scared sound.
Yeah, so the appetitive ones are higher range and the aversive ones are lower, and that's actually beneficial because the lower range frequency vocalizations can travel farther.
Right.
So you can pick up
That's
that
right.
Signal from further away.
Continuing the question about the diversity across species, I'm working with humans, but talking with Tony a little about it, I know that there's differences between rats and mice in terms of how well they can catch things and what's the level of difficulty in the experiment that you can actually implement. Is there also a difference significant difference between rats and mice in terms of social avoidance and what they can pick up?
You've worked with both, so you might have a better answer for that.
Yeah, the thing is that typically we think as rats being smarter.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some truth to it because you can just teach rats a lot more things within one session than mice, but that's not to say that also mice can pick up on complex behaviors even through observation. There are studies and there are researchers out there trying similar tasks with observational means, though most of the observational research has been done from the standpoint of learning about threat, based on tone cue or cue shock associations, but more complex behaviors like, okay, learn that, but also learn to avoid it. That's more complex, and perhaps she's setting her.
I was almost wondering if the limitation that you see with mice able to learn a lot of things at an artificial setting may not be seen as to that degree when you're talking about more maybe natural situations like social learning. I don't know if that's true, right? But I wonder.
My guess is that a lot of observational learning requires, all these medial prefrontal, orbital, cingulate regions of the brain thought to play roles in higher order cognition, right? Just for the mere fact that in order to learn by observation, you need to engage empathy pathways, right? Who gets, the most developed empathy pathways, rats or mice? I don't know the answer to that question, but that could
I don't think
be
of either
one of the
one
issues.
that's particularly empathetic.
Yeah,
Dogs are empathetic.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, this gets me back to my original question, which I don't want to force it on you because I know it's a hard question, but if we think about how these brain areas actually cooperate in learning, then maybe it's good to just sort of boil it down to the simplest thing, like some Pavlovian conditioning or Pavlovian fear conditioning or something. There's a stimulus, and there's a representation of that stimulus in the form of neuronal activity, and people have measured that, and we can kind of know something about it. And then there's a representation of the movement that needs to be made. That's a little bit more complicated, but it's not qualitatively different. It's just that we haven't mapped out the movement pathways as well. And then there's some kind of signal that comes from the actual getting shocked, And so you could easily imagine that the synaptic connections between the stimulus and the motor pathway get strengthened over the course of trials. I mean, but that's what Pavlovian guys normally think about what's happening. So, so to the extent that oversimplification is true, then how do we picture that happening in the observational learning? So there's no shock. I mean, the sensory stimulus is probably still there. Like if there's a tone, the animal is watching hears the tone.
Yeah, it's a good question. What is associated? What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, so if you think about observational learning, when you could say like, okay, in this specific situation, you're learning about avoidance. That's different from learning about maybe fear conditioning or something else that's scary, like seeing a predator or something. But the animal, that's the observer, might have some prior experience with something similar, right? Like seeing something scary or whatever. So they could use those prior experiences to try to figure out what is it that I'm actually watching. And thinking about it from the brain point of view, okay, they might be recruiting those memories and circuits related to those memories to try to understand, okay, what's going on here. And then later, when they directly experience it, they would recruit those circuits or whatever memory retrieval happened. But if it's all completely new, they've never heard this tone before, they've never felt a shock before, maybe they've never even seen another rat before. All of this is new. And so maybe when they're observing it, that this is all new information, but then probably using that information in a different way, less related to prior experience. So maybe that's a different circuit that's being recruited. So I would say, that could be more maybe ACC related or some kind of observational circuit related that they can then use later when they're directly experiencing that to help them learn.
So this is in the reinforcement pathway we're talking about, because now whatever representation there is for the shock, that's the missing representation. And so somehow the animal has to construct a representation of the shock by watching the other animal get shocked. That's the problem for that.
Perhaps it's not exactly a representation of the shock, but I think you're like right on spot, because when the field was revived again with that Gion paper, and then with Marie Monfils at UT Austin on what is actually being learned in terms of stimuli. Is it environmental stimuli, or is a combination of environmental stimuli with some sort of understanding of what is happening to the other individual, like the demonstrator in these experiments? Basically, you need to engage empathy pathways to try to come up with some kind of meaning, right? And understanding the emotions of other individuals, and that whatever understanding is associated with the environmental cues, right?
Do rats have mirror cells, just like our?
Some people say they do.
Yeah.
Say what
Yeah.
that is for a second.
Mirror cells?
Yeah.
So these are cells that are reacting to a particular action or movement that others are doing as well as I'm doing. Not just my own, but they recognize that there is a mirroring. So, for example, when I raise my hand, but also when you raise my hand, the mirror cell would fire.
Yeah, so I think of it in that kind of motor context.
Mhm.
Like if I do this, or I see somebody doing that, then the motor system that has to be engaged for me to do this gets engaged when I see somebody else do it, which is
What you would,
was not expected when it was first discovered.
right? But it sounds like very to the point,
Yeah.
right? In this kind of like seeing another rat
But if
freezes.
But if you think about, like mirror neuron effects are, very related to, or it could be engaged through empathy pathways as well. Because,
People think that mirror
like-
cells are
like
basis of
like-
empathy, right?
us humans, like we see somebody crying, like I would cry too, right?
These are
You s-
emotional
yeah,
mirror cells
see
as opposed to
You see
motor.
somebody laughing, other people
Yeah.
will laugh as well, right?
Right.
Like the contagion effect, right? I've seen in mice work that I did as part of my postdoctoral training that when demonstrator animals, and these were mice, they would try some kind of strategies to cope with the food shocks, and they would do like backflips, right? And when demonstrators exhibited backflips, then observers will also try the backflips for any kind of reason, right? They never were experiencing the shock, but they will also do the backflips, right?
Yeah.
And you asked the question, is
Mousy see,
observation?
mousy do.
Yeah, it's observational learning or behavior. What is it, right? There's some learning component, but the
Yeah.
learning component would engage, like just trying to understand the emotions of another individual or conspecific. But also a lot of it, I would say it may be accidental just by doing whatever he's doing, even though I have no good understanding why am I doing it.
The stuff you said about vocalizations really, I really want to follow up on that a little bit because we don't normally hear these vocalizations from the rats. You can make them squeak, but that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about vocalizations that are mostly above our hearing range.
Yeah.
And so we don't notice that they're talking to each other all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like you can identify basically two words, one which means good and one which means bad, or something like that, and which are the two first words you need to know. And so how much do they use it? I mean, if you have animals that are an animal observing an animal that is learning to avoid a shock, how much vocalization is going on? Is that enough? I mean, could that be what is being used to tell what's going on?
We haven't tested that yet in my lab, but we do think that that could be one way that they would be communicating this information with each other. Especially if the demonstrator is brand new to the task and he doesn't know what's going on, he might be vocalizing right during the tone or after the shock or something like that, that the observer could pick up on and use that information later, like, oh, something bad was happening here, in addition to seeing the animal freeze, or if the demonstrator is giving off some olfactory cues that something bad is going on, they could potentially use all that information to realize, okay, this is not a good situation. The tone means something weird is going on. So then when they go and experience that later, they'll be, oh yeah, that something bad happened. Something bad's going to happen now.
And so then all I have to do is figure out what is the bad thing and how to avoid it. But you've seen it being avoided. So you might think that rats would be super good at, if they're using vocalization, they'd be super good at learning quickly by watching. So can you just say how quickly they learn? If you have like in your preparation where you have an observer rat and a demonstrator rat, and the demonstrator rat is learning the task, how long does it take the demonstrator rat to learn?
Well, for the demonstrator, we kind of do our standard procedure of 10 days of the avoidance task where they get 9 tone shock trials per day. Usually around the 3rd or 4th day, they're starting to get on the platform a lot more every time the tone turns on. And so with our observational task, we have observers watch a beginner demonstrator, so one that is going to do the first day of avoidance conditioning and doesn't really know what's going on, but learns it in that first day. And then we have other observers that watch an advanced demonstrator. So they've done the task for 9 days, and they watch the last day of training. And by this point, the demonstrator, he's not reacting to many shocks because he already knows tone means shock. I can get away from the shock by getting onto the platform. And so the observer is seeing a lot of, okay, this demonstrator hears a tone and goes to the platform. And that's most of what he sees, aside from pressing outside the tone. But the beginner demonstrator might be doing a lot more behaviors, right? He's reacting to the shock. He's jumping around, escaping, lands on the platform, discovers the platform is safe. And so by the end of the first day, he's spending more time on the platform.
So if I'm a observer and I'm watching one whole day, I've seen basically everything that can happen, including success.
Yes,
Not just
especially from the beginner demonstrator who's kind of discovering all of this, through direct experience. And then another condition we're interested in is, seeing if you have prior shock experience or not. Does that help you learn through observation better? And we do see that. We see that if the observer rat has prior shock experience and then watches this beginner demonstrator go through PMA training, his avoidance, he avoids more in his test compared to rats that don't have prior shock
So
experience.
he makes the connection. That's a shock. That's
Yeah,
what that
yeah.
animal is feeling.
Yeah.
My friend is feeling a shock. Same as what I.
Something bad is happening, perhaps because there are ultrasonic vocalizations and all these other behaviors. But basically, long story short, there's like no short answer for your question of what is actually getting associated, but it seems to be way more complicated, right? And the field is just in its infancy, right? There's so many variables to be controlled that to get a clear answer at this point, it's almost quite a challenge, right? But at least we know from your work that this kind of observational learning processes are engaging prefrontal cortical areas, again, thought to be, like up there at the top of the brain, serving as a higher order master, not only processing information, but controlling downstream brain regions. So what do you say about, which part of the prefrontal cortex is more important? Are there slight variations that would tilt the balance towards other observational forms of learning, like appetitive versus dangerous? Are there any clues in the literature for this?
Those are good questions. I would say a lot of the literature now is kind of pointing to this anterior cingulate cortex region, which is known to be involved in many different things, including pain perception. So it's kind of no wonder, if you're observing something that has a dangerous or bad outcome component to it, the ACC would probably be involved in trying to interpret, there's something bad happening. It looks like that other animal is experiencing pain, right? So we think that's a big player. And then also thinking about how those brain areas that are activated or important for encoding what's happening during the observation, how does that map onto the circuits of the brain that are important for doing or learning the task through direct means, right? So with active avoidance, we know medial prefrontal is very important, prelimbic cortex, and maybe infralimbic for certain situations. And then also that learning the tone shock association, the BLA.
Would you say what that means?
The basolateral amygdala. So understanding the tone is going to lead to shock, and then being able to do something about it, the ventral striatum, going to the platform and being safe and protected from that.
So how do you find out those things? Like how is it that you can say that anterior cingulate cortex is part of it?
Well, there's lots of different ways. One is to inactivate those brain areas to see if we turn it off temporarily, does that impair the behavior? So that's been done a lot in the field, either through lesions, which are permanent inactivations of the brain that doesn't come back, or maybe through pharmacological means where you give a drug, put it in that brain area, it turns off temporarily, and we can see, does the animal do the behavior or not? Then you can test them again the next day when the drug washes away and see, oh, yeah, the behavior comes back. So this area likely plays a role. But there's more advanced techniques now that have become developed where we can target specific neuron types. We can look at specific projections in the brain. Is the prefrontal cortex talking to this region or that region? We can dissect all of that out. We can see if it's dopamine neurons or glutamatergic neurons, GABAergic neurons. There's lots of different ways to tease all those aspects apart.
What about extinction? First of all, is it studied as well? Like after I learned by observation, I need to extinct it by observation. If it was, I guess the timeline is different, or is it like extinction for the individual that, there's all kind of evidence to suggest that when you extinct the memory, it's not really gone, it's just being inhibited, and would be the same with avoidance?
With respect to observational learning, a fear or avoidance, I don't know of any studies that look at extinction of that after observational learning. I do know of some studies where, like in the presence of another conspecific animal, does that, does that social buffering facilitate extinction, things like that? That's been done a little bit in fear conditioning and extinction, but not with avoidance extinction that I'm aware of.
Me neither.
Yeah. So again.
So extinction by observation was not really examined.
I don't think so. Not that I know of.
Isn't that surprising?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's still the first steps of this.
It's an opportunity for somebody out.
That would be a bigger challenge because, just to begin with, learning to extinguish fear responses in, all across species, rats, mice, humans, is more difficult of a process than just learning, to fear an environment.
Yeah, it's easier to realize that you're doing when you're shocked, then you're not doing it anymore, right?
Yeah. I guess but even so, if rodents can learn anything from another conspecific, like a tone means shock or serves as a warning signal, or through mirror neuron-like effects. Whatever you throw into them, they will do it. Eventually, there's going to be some kind of accidental signal. It's possible. But for extinction itself, I'm not aware of those studies. Are you aware of any human study doing observational learning? So we could gather stronger insights just by asking them, what do you think, what's happening to that other individual? I'm not aware of observational learning in humans.
I'm sure there's some cooperative games where they're working together.
That for sure, yeah.
Right.
But
observational.
I don't know as well.
There's a study I know. One, it was kind of a question asking about in autism subjects with autism spectrum. Can they learn a task? Like I remember there was this paper I've shown to some of my students in my class where they are given a video of an adult, working this puzzle box and showing them the different steps to open it up or something like that. And then they're later tested. So there's something like that where they test, in children and things like, can they learn how to figure out this puzzle by watching a video or, watching someone do it in front of them.
Right.
And usually they will have more trouble than, a typically developing child, like figuring out those kinds of things. So there might be some in the children's literature in development.
But it wouldn't necessarily be in the fear conditioning and extinction.
No.
Yeah. So I guess maybe the answer is now going to be kind of straightforward, but my next question would be, being the sleep and memory person, is whether, because you're doing this over a few days, right? So they must be sleeping, and I wonder how sleep would affect this observational learning. But if it's very new, then maybe people haven't looked at it, you know?
I would definitely say you need sleep to learn,
Right.
to consolidate the memory and store it long term so that you can use it later.
Right, but I wonder if they actually, people have measured sleep and how it accelerates or not observational learning in rats.
Yeah, for my knowledge, I think those studies are lacking. Just straightforward post-observational learning treatments to impair just consolidation, with or without sleeping, I think those are lacking at this point, right? So it's wide open, still wide open. Yeah. Could I ask, since you have a major component of your research looking for any potential sex differences, differences in between male and female rats, what have you seen so far? How would you summarize it? Are females better than males learning through observation, or vice versa?
So with our observational avoidance task, we looked at whether, having prior shock experience or not affects how they learn avoidance. And then also watching a beginner demonstrator versus an advanced demonstrator. And then we have enough animals now to see, are there differences in male rats that observe this or female rats? And what's interesting is that the male rats who have the prior shock experience learn avoidance more quickly than the males who don't have the prior shock experience. But in female rats, we don't see that difference. So, and that's also regardless of which stage of avoidance they observe, a beginning demonstrator or an advanced demonstrator. The females learn the same, whether they have the prior shock experience or not.
And in terms of the main effect?
In terms of learning the avoidance task, there's no differences in females who have shock experience or not.
No, that, I understand. So that's kind of like an interaction between the sex and whether you have prior experience. But in general, overall conditions of prior or not prior, is there a difference between the males and the females?
With the observational learning? No, only when we look at the shock experience do we see the differences.
I see.
So it seems like the shock experience helps the males learn better, but doesn't really matter if the female knows.
Maybe the female rats have a better understanding through empathy processing of what might be going on with the other individual, right? As opposed to males. We need, actually to feel it in order to understand it better.
Yeah.
That could be a possibility.
Yeah.
I'm just
And they
trying
could
to
be using
simplify.
other cues, right? When they're watching the demonstrator, maybe they're using more vocalizations, we don't know, or some other kind of cues.
But within your experiments, so you have like female-female pairs, right? You don't have like across sexes.
No.
Didn't I see, I don't know if it was one of your papers or another paper, that there is like when you have a companion that you're learning faster or slower? I don't remember. What was it exactly?
So we did another type of avoidance task that has a social component where we just have two rats learning together for the first time. So kind of using the same cage, but they each have their own platform and lever and sucrose food dish. We wanted to see if learning in the presence of another rat has any effect versus learning by themselves.
And it's still observational learning, correct? Or it wasn't?
There's those cues that are present. So they could look at their partner and see, what are they doing? Okay, I could do that too. But they're doing it together.
I see.
Something that interesting that we see is both groups of rats, whether they learn alone or with a partner, they avoid pretty much the same. They have similar rates of avoidance learning, spending time on the platform. But when we look at their freezing, that was the most surprising effect we found, was that in the social condition, when rats are learning with another rat, they're freezing more during this task compared to when they learn by themselves. And I thought I would expect the opposite, right? If you're learning alone, you might be more afraid, but if there's another individual there, that might help you feel better. But we kind of looked in the literature and saw that in some studies are looking at the cessation of movement as a cue for potential threat. So if you think, if we're all sitting here and then some loud sound happens and we all stop, we would see from each other that, oh, you stopped moving. Why did you stop moving? You're tending to something else. What's going on? So that really grabs your attention. And so maybe animals use that as a cue of like, oh, something dangerous is happening. What are we going to do?
Right. So they don't only trust themselves; they trust their partner to give them threat cues.
Yeah. And so seeing another animal freeze might make you freeze even more. And then the other difference we see in the social versus solitary situation is in solitary, they press more during the ITI. So they're seeking the food more. And that kind of makes sense. If there's nothing else to do, you're just going to sit there and press the lever. But if there's another individual around, you might, look at them, check them out, what's going on. If you're on the platform, you might go over there too to see what they're doing.
And what's the difference between males and females in this respect?
If with the sex difference, the females were avoiding more in the solitary condition than the males were, but in the social conditions, that effect went away. But across both conditions, the males were pressing more than the females. And some people said, oh, that's interesting because we usually see the females pressing or food seeking more than males in our situation. So that could be a strain difference or mouse versus rat difference. We don't know.
And in those experiments, those two rats they knew each other from before, or they were kind of like completely separated?
We try to control for that so that they're not cage mates. They're non-cage mate partners, but in our lab, we also breed our rats. So they're usually from the same litter.
Right.
So they might have some distant memory that, they were in the cage with mom together.
Right.
And then we wean them and they're in the same colony room together. So if they're talking to each other across cages, that can happen too.
They could say, hey, Pepe, long time no see, right?
I was training today.
I guess, the field is wide open and there's so many questions to be answered, throw in like social ranking phenomena, because, who do I trust better to learn from, like from a dominant or, like the new guy on the block, right? I guess all those questions are still very young and need, systematic ways to actually investigate those questions.
So maybe the reason that there's a tradition of testing animals one at a time and training them one at a time is just with the idea that it's simpler.
Exactly.
You get rid of a bunch of variables.
Exactly.
But some of those variables might be the most interesting.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of methodology, I learned from Tony that there's all these relatively new things where, you video everything and then you do like sophisticated video analysis that allows you to extract information from freezing to something much more interesting even, just from video analysis. Is this something that can be used for observational studies, or this is too difficult? Requires too much of a sophisticated visual analysis, or maybe now you could do it with AI tools. I don't know.
I think with the observational setup, it would be very easy because they're usually separated. Mm-hmm. We have the observer in a separate chamber from the demonstrator who's getting those foot shocks because we don't want the observer to feel any of the foot shocks. Mm-hmm. And so when it's set up that way, you could have one camera on the observer who's in his own little box and then the one camera on the demonstrator. So you could separate those out that way. When you want to look at, real social interactions where there's no barrier there, that's when it gets tricky. Right. And, we're starting to see some new analyses develop where you can separate out, animal tracking if there's more than one animal. It's taken a while. In the past, I think a lot of people would try to mark the animals with markers or something. And then other people were saying, oh, no, you can't do that because that changes the way they interact with each other because they see this strange mark on them and they want to investigate it or something like that.
And could you, for example, using these tools, even in the separated version, the easier one, detect some small movements in the demonstrator that predict the rat is watching that something is happening, like it's this type of freeze and not that type of freeze. Again, I'm trying to think about what you can utilize sophisticated visual analysis tools in order to capture what is it that they're learning, really, by observing.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, I think you have sufficient data to start getting massive flows of measurements through computer vision algorithms, right, and AI. There's many behaviors that we just don't notice by eye, especially since we scientists have a whole bunch of a priori hypotheses, right, uh, of measurements that would fit our stories,
we don't see the rest.
right, and we don't see the rest, right, by eye. But I'm guessing like if you could get your data through deep lab code and then keep on mosaic just to get all those very tiny patterns that perhaps repeat
Mm-hmm.
for differently for distinct animals, depending on whether I'm learning from a beginner demonstrator or a really well refined demonstrator.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well,
Yeah.
It seems like there are a lot of opportunities,
yeah,
and we're expecting to see a lot happen in the future of this.
we need programmers like you, Charlie, to do this kind of analysis. It's a problem.
Thank you for joining us, Maria.
Thank you. It's fun.
Tony, and Itamar.
Thank you.
This has been Neuroscientists Talk Shop.